Today we're going to talk about background objects in MindManager 19. And these are a fairly recent introduction. And what we're going to do is not just show you how to use them, but talk about why you'd use them as well. Just to reiterate, this is aimed at users of MindManager version 19 for Windows only. So we're demonstrating on Microsoft Windows. It isn't for Mac, MindManager for Mac, so it's just for Windows. And a little bit of experience with MindManager is going to help as well. Familiarity with the basics of the software and the concepts of drawing maps. But it's not going to. We're not going to get into a lot of technical detail, but it is like all things in MindManager. When you start to look into it, there's a lot of stuff in there. There's a lot of possibilities in there. And as Stephen mentioned, this map that I'm presenting from here, it does contain all the examples that we'll see today, and you'll be able to get a download of that after the webinar. Now, on the left-hand side of the central topic in this map, we've drawn a picture using MindManager's background objects, and this is to orient you about where they are and how they fit in. So this trapezoid shape is a funnel shape, but if you can stretch your imagination and visualize it as a list of things where the front at the bottom is nearest to you and the top at the back is furthest away from you, the background. This shows the different layers in a MindManager map, the way that it's built up, and the priorities and the way that they overlay each other. So right at the back, at the bottom level, we have the map background, which has been in MindManager ever since the beginning. And then right at the front, you have the topics in the tree, which is on the right-hand side of the map as we're looking at it now, which is really the main information that you're working with. And then background objects sit between the map background and topic boundaries and floating topics, which means that they're shapes that you can draw in the map that go over the top of the background, but you can put other things on top of them. So the topic boundary will overlap a background object. Floating topics and tree topics will also overlap background objects. They're really designed to create a structure for floating topics. That's the primary use for background objects. You can use them in other ways, but that's where they're designed to sit. So that's the order of elements that build up a MindManager map. So that's just to get you oriented on what we're talking about here. We're talking about shapes that you can draw behind the topics in your maps. But the bigger question is, what are they the answer to? If they're the answer, what is the question? Let's start with having a quick look at a background object. And this map here is a little map for a RASI group, which is a little management tool for showing who's accountable, who's informed, who's consulted, who's responsible for various things. And this is an example in a business. And the way that this is drawn is the grid in the background. The rectangular regular shape is a background object, and then we've used floating topics to actually put content in the cells. So unlike a Word document where you've got everything is at the same level, you draw a box and then you type the text in, we're using two different types of objects in MindManager, which gives great flexibility. It means that things can be put into a grid or into a swim lane or over the top of another object, and they're fully functioning topics, so you can do everything with them that you can do with topics. So they can be the rooted trees, you can have hyperlinks, you can have notes, you can have icons, you can have color. There's all sorts of processing you can do with that. The grid in the background is locked, and I'll show you how to do that in a little while, which means that if we move the topics around, if we edit the floating topics, the grid stays where it is in the background. But this is an example of combining a shape that's sitting between the map background and our floating topics, and then putting floating topics over the top of that to give structure to that. So it's a very different direction that MindManager is heading in. Over the years, MindManager is really focused on drawing tree diagrams, Now it's extending sideways into other areas, into other ways to present information, but still keeping the relationship with tree diagrams and the power of that. And this, I guess, is in part reflected. This is one of the outcomes of Corel being very interested in MindManager, not just as a tool for drawing trees, but as a graphic tool. So this is the kind of direction that the product is heading in. In the past, if you've spent your time watching other webinars, you'll have heard me talk about process, and process is the heart of using this tool. It's where the majority of the value comes from when developing visualizations. It's not a question of drawing a map. It's a question of how you got there, and the journey there is a big part of the value. Mind mapping software makes it very easy to have a conversation with yourself or with others to develop ideas and get things structured, spot the gaps, spot the patterns, find the principles, and make things make sense. So it's the type of diagram that you draw is a big part of the process, and it shapes your thinking. So if you start drawing trees, then the kind of thinking you're going to do is going to be very much based on looking for patterns, looking for things that are missing, breaking down big things into smaller parts to understand them, and develop things that way. If you start with a table, if you draw a table instead of a tree, then the kinds of thinking you're going to be doing is, again, looking for the patterns, looking for what's missing, but you're not necessarily breaking down into more and more detail. You're thinking about things very much at the same level. You're thinking about combinations of situations. So this diagram here, the RASI grid, is a combination of 3 different types of information, which is quite difficult to draw in a tree. Another aspect of this is complicated versus complex. Now, we tend to use these 2 words interchangeably, tend to use either complex or complicated, but they actually mean 2 different things. Something that's very complicated has got lots of detail, but it follows rules. You can break it down, you can divide it, you can understand it, and you can solve it, and it behaves predictably. So a complicated thing is something like computer programming or machines, or the tax code, the way that tax works. By contrast, a complex thing is something that has got lots of interdependencies. When you change one part of it, something else changes. It might even seem to be acting unpredictably. And if you do any kind of analysis or breakdown, it's very conditional. You have to say, under these special conditions, then we can understand this. And you can't really solve complex things. You can really only manage them. So complex things are behavior of society, market economics, politics, things that it's difficult to make solid rules about. It's difficult to make predictions from. Another consideration is how many dimensions you've got of things. If you can categorize things by a single exclusive relationship, then a tree is going to be a really good way to draw that. So if you break down a car engine into its components, then each component only belongs to the engine. They don't belong to something else. If it's part of the engine, it's part of the engine. Again, family tree, everybody's only got one mother. And in a different way, things with multiple dimensions, like the RASI grid we just looked at, you've got knowledge coming from an intersection of multiple pieces of information. So where does all this lead us to? It's interesting ideas, but if we look at the way trees and diagrams compare, trees are really good for complicated things. They're good for lots of detail. They're good for modeling exclusive relationships. They're not so good for complex things, multiple dimensions, and they're quite poor for explaining complex things like the political system. The tree would be it would have to be quite a special case to be able to draw a useful map of that. But other types of diagram, like concept maps, block diagrams, anything that's 2-dimensional, is much better for explaining complex things, much better for explaining multiple dimensional things and for the bigger picture. So what MindManager is taking you to is the ability to draw different types of diagram that can give your users a different perspective of how something works together, how to understand it. And you can mix that kind of diagram, like a table or a flow chart or a block diagram, together with a map that has all the detail. So you really get the best of both worlds just in one place, in one package. So when you're choosing whether to draw a table or a map, have a think about whether the subject is complicated or complex, whether you're going to be able to draw out the right kind of explanation, give people a good overview on that. So that's a bit of the theory about what you can do and why you start to choose different types of diagram in MindManager beyond trees. Let's dig into what background objects actually are. In MindManager, we'll start looking at the product itself now, and then I'll come back later on in the webinar to different ways to use the background objects to get their value from using them. We looked just now at the layering in MindManager maps, right the way through from the map background up to tree topics, and looking particularly at background objects, the shapes you can draw in the background. They can have their own ordering as well, so you can put them in front or behind of each other. They stay in the same place. Once you draw them in the background, that's where they are. They don't move around on their own, so they're not dynamic. And in that respect, they're unlike the trees that MindManager draws, because they expand and collapse as you navigate around and things move out of the way to make room for them. A map background object will stay in the same place. They've got different attributes like the geometry, rotation, size, color, transparency, that kind of thing, but they do have fewer content attributes and topics. So a map background object doesn't have a hyperlink or notes or icons, it's just a shape. So really the design of map background objects is meant to complement floating topics, complement topics in the map, rather than replace it. Let's have a look at the types of map background objects. What I've done here is drawn a little gallery of the different shapes that you've got. It's a closed palette. That means you can't design your own shapes, so you can choose the ones that are here already. But this is the set that you have to work with. They're divided into two groups: there's shapes and there are smart shapes. Shapes are geometric objects, and we'll do a bit of drawing and moving them around in a bit so you can see how they work. But basically, if you can put together a diagram using these elements, then you'll be able to draw most types of diagram. So we've got the basic shapes. It's hard to see the rounded rectangle has got rounded corners, but you can make the radius bigger on that if you want to. And a few different types of triangle. The circle can be both a circle and an ellipse. It can be drawn as either. And there's only one right arrow, but you can flip it or rotate it to point in any direction. And then there's a few other extra ones as well. And then there are two that are a horizontal and vertical line if you want to just place a divider between sections of a diagram. You can also import an image and put an image into the map background. That does. It's a little bit like a floating topic with an image in it, but you've got you can group it together with other objects to make a more sophisticated diagram. And then there's a text box background object there, where you can write some text that sits in the map background, and it isn't dynamic. It doesn't change in any way. You might use it perhaps for the legends on a graph or a chart, something like that. So those are the shapes. And then the other group of background objects are the smart shapes, and these are they're containers for floating topics primarily. We've got three different types: horizontal swim lanes, which can be horizontal or vertical, a funnel, which is a trapezoid, so it tapers from one end to the other, and then a table, which is a grid. And the difference between shapes and smart shapes is that smart shapes, you can say how many swim lanes you want or how many rows you want in your table. You can type in a number and it'll draw a table of that many rows or columns for you. So these they change their geometry, and they change the way that the number of cells they've got in them. You can specify that, and they work together with smart rules as well. So smart shapes, when you put something in a particular cell, then MindManager can process what's in that cell. It can respond to that position. We'll look at that in a minute as well. So those are the different types of objects in the background. Now, an important thing to remember is that the relative positions of background objects and floating topics are defined by you. They're not defined by the software. The background objects stay where they are when you've drawn them. The floating topics might or might not stay where they are. They can be moved around if you move another floating topic too near to it, or if you expand a tree and it pushes the floating topics out of the way. They mostly stay where they are. And the tree topics will move around as you expand and collapse them. But where you're combining floating topics and a background object, that creates some kind of knowledge. That creates more information than the two bits in isolation. So if you put a floating topic into a cell in a table like we did with the RASI grid, that creates some visual information, and that information is mostly visual, although the smart rules I mentioned earlier on can help to interpret that. But you're in control of how it actually works. It could be that at some point in the future there are extensions for MindManager that automatically draw these smart objects and create tables and create funnel diagrams for dashboards dynamically, but at the moment it's all manually done. So let's start creating some background objects so you can see how to use this stuff. The first thing to do is to make sure you've got the option for the alignment helper enabled in the File Options menu. So if we go to File and Options, then the Edit page, there's a option right at the bottom that says use the alignment helper when dragging objects, and I'll switch that on and we'll see what that actually does. But that's a really helpful device when you start drawing freehand and moving things around in the map background. So we would turn that option on to enable the alignment helper. Got quite a big palette of different operations here, and you'll get a copy of the map that we're about to go to. This is a grid of all the different things you can do with background objects, and I'll zoom in a little bit so you can see some of this. And what we've done is in each section we've written some notes and tips, hints and tips on what you can do. So I'll leave that in view at the moment so you can just see a little bit of what's going on there. But when you get a copy of this map, then you can come to this map and just destroy it. You can experiment to your heart's content and try all the different things to do with background objects. The first thing is how do you create them? How do you insert or even copy them? In the Insert tab, if you go to the Insert tab, there's a section called Objects, and in Objects we've got Shapes, Smart Shapes, Image and Text Box. You'll have seen relationships and boundaries before. They're the connectors that join topics together, or you can draw a boundary around a group of topics. But the background objects are these four things that follow that. And in that palette we've got the different shapes that we looked at earlier on. So if I click on rectangle and just drag it in the background, drag from one corner to the other, it draws a background object rectangle in the map. And I can now copy this, press Ctrl+C, click somewhere else, press Ctrl+V, and make a copy of that background object. So if you create one and you want 5 of them, just use copy and paste to paste them in the background. If you want to delete one, you just select it just by clicking on it, and you get the green handles around it. Press the delete key and it's gone. So it's this is very much like any other graphics type of software that you might use in Windows. Very familiar with that. If we come on to selecting, you can select an object, background object, just by clicking on it. and you just get the latest one you clicked on. If you want to select multiple ones, you can click on one and then press the Control key and click on another one and keep on clicking till you've got all the ones selected. So if you want to do an operation that requires multiple background objects, you can use the Control key to control click, or you can lasso around them. You can just draw in the background, draw a lasso around them, and as the lasso goes around each object, they highlight, so you can see just by drawing a rectangle around them. And that's the same as using the lasso to select multiple floating topics or multiple topics in the map. So that's selecting objects. If we want to size and rotate them, you can select a background object and just click the grab handles to size it. And what you'll see as I move this around is a green dotted line appearing as you resize or as you move things. And this is the alignment helper that we switched on earlier on. And when it finds that it's in line with the edge of something else or the center of something else, it throws this green line up. So this makes it really convenient, very quick to either make things the same size or center them with each other, because the alignment helper helps you to spot when you've got something lined up or aligned with something else. If we want to rotate a background object, you can either click on the little rotate handles in the corner, and that'll rotate it by 45 degrees, or you can drag on those and just do a free rotate and rotate something to any angle that you wish. So you can resize and rotate the background objects and get them to go anywhere you want to, really, any size you want to. That's in the user interface. If you want an exact size, you can select a background object, right click on it and choose Format Object. And in the Format Object, down at the bottom, in most cases, you'll see fields for the size, the width and the height. So these will vary by the different type of object, but you can set those to any number you actually want. So if you want something to be an exact size, instead of trying to get it exactly the right size with the mouse, you can come in here and put the actual numbers in that you want. And again, you can also set a rotation. So if we want this exactly 16 degrees rotated, we can do that. We can change the size and set the rotation numerically as well. So that gives you a very precise control. As I say, if you want a set of objects that all need to be exactly the same size, you can define the numbers, or you can do it by hand. And to move them around, you can again just select an object, and you'll see when the mouse goes over the object, you get the little move mouse pointer there, and that means that you can drag a background object around, and just like when you were resizing it, the alignment helper lines appear as it goes into alignment with other things in your map to help you drop it in exactly the right place. So you can move things with the mouse. You can also, if you have a background object selected, move them with the arrow keys. So here I'm not using the mouse, I'm pressing the arrow keys on the keyboard, and that moves the background object by a couple of millimeters at a time. You can just move it up and down. And this will snap to the grid if you've got the grid enabled. So you can move a background object like that. If you select a group of background objects, if I use the arrow keys and I've got 3 of them selected there, you can move them all together. And you can also move floating topics as well. Let's destroy this one. This is a floating topic here. I can move that when it's selected with the arrow key. If I put it up near the background objects, I can select the floating topic together with the background objects and move them all together when they're all selected. So if you have a group of background objects and some floating topics and you want the whole lot somewhere else, then you can select them all, lasso around the whole lot, and move them all as a unit, which is quite convenient. So that's sizing, rotating, moving. We'd mentioned aligning a bit earlier. You can not only use the alignment helpers, there I'm using the alignment helper to align the left-hand side of the pink circle with the rectangle, but you can select multiple background objects. If you select more than one of them, so if I select the circle and the rectangle there, in the Format menu, I can use the Align command. So if you go to the Format tab and Align, and I can now align these left. So you can use the menu command to align either left, right, middle, center, top or bottom with a multiple selection of background objects. And that works if you select more than one background object. You can also select topics as well. So I can align, I've selected a floating topic and two background objects there, and I can align those left. If you want to align, if you've got one of them in the right place already, let's say the rectangle is correctly aligned and I want the circle to align with that. We saw earlier how you can use control click to multiple select. So if I do, if I select that circle there and then control click on the rectangle, the last one that you add to the selection, the very last one that you click on, becomes a reference object. So if I now align left for those two objects, it will align the circle with the rectangle, not vice versa. If I wanted to align the rectangle with the circle, I would do the selection where the circle was the last object I selected. So if you want to align things with something with one thing that's already in the right place, then make sure that's the last thing that you do the selection on. Now, layering objects, we looked at the way that the position of background objects in the overall picture of how the map is, but within themselves as a group, you can put objects in different order. So in this example, we've got the circle on top of the rectangle. We've got the star on top of the circle. If I want to bring the rectangle to the front, I can right click on it and then there's a group of commands here. You can send things backwards or put them to the bottom or the top. So if I bring that rectangle to the top, then the rectangle now overlays the circle. So once you've got all the bits of your diagram that you want, you can put them in the right order. And if you lose something, if you're sure you drew something but you can't see it anymore, it might be hidden behind another one. So you might need to move that out of the way to find that. But if you've done any sort of drawing in PowerPoint or something like that, these concepts will be very familiar. But the objects can overlay each other. You can also see one object through another by changing its transparency. So if I select the circle again and make it more transparent, make it 60%, oh sorry, wrong way around. If I select the rectangle and make it 50% transparent, you can see through it to what's underneath. So you can change transparency of background objects. Now, topics will always stay on the top. So whatever you do with the ordering of background objects, whatever that order is, you can't put a background object in front of a topic. Topics will always be above background objects in the map. Now we're getting onto some of the more advanced features. Background objects can have a name. If I right click on this background object and do Format Object, one of the fields that you can type in there, which isn't populated by default, is the object name. So you can give it a name and apply that. That might not seem to be very helpful until you start hunting for a particular one. And in the index, the map index, in the Elements tab, normally you'd use the markers, but if you've ever looked in this Elements tab, it indexes all the other components of your map as well. You can see objects, background objects. And somewhere down here, we've got pink circle. So I was able to give that object a name, and that helps me to find it. You can see by default that that the internal name that these objects get just reflects the type of shape they are, and then it adds a number to that. But if you want to be able to find something again later on, which becomes very important when you start locking and unlocking and grouping, then giving them name by right-clicking on an object and entering a name is very helpful for being able to find that later on. And once you've created your shapes, you can do more formatting on them. So the kinds of the things that you can change here are the pattern of lines, the weight of lines, the fill color, and as in most things with MindManager, there's more than one way to do this. So I can right click on it on an object and to choose format object, and then you've got your options for the border color and weight and pattern, the fill color and transparency. Or if I select an object and go to the Format tab, the fill color and line color, which in the past have only changed the fill and line colors for topics and other objects, now apply to the background object. So I can change the fill color of a background object here. So you can do that from the menus up here. Now, bear in mind that when you change these fill colors and line weights, so if I make that a really bold border there, they stay that way. That is what gets used for the next background object that you create. But again, there's a couple of ways to change the format of those. Smart shapes are a bit different. I'm missing out text box here. We've got a text box object which you'd insert by going to the Insert tab and then clicking on text box and drawing the background. Text boxes are formatted by the font settings in the Format tab, or you can right click on them and choose Format Object. But this time you just get the font formatting dialog, so your font and the font style and the size, like regular font. Or you can select a text box and just increase the text size by clicking on the font size in the font group there. There are no background colors or borders for text boxes. They're always transparent, so whatever you put them over will be seen through the text box. We're nearly there. Formatting of smart shapes. Smart shapes are a little bit different because when you go to Format Object, not only do you have things like your background color and line weight and pattern, but you've also got extra fields down here for changing the number of columns or rows depending on what kind of smart shape it is. So if I increase this this table from 3 by 3 to 5 by 5 and click OK, it redraws the smart shape there. Grouping objects is really useful. If you draw multiple objects and they all belong together as a single diagram, you can select them and group them. So do a multiple select, drag around them. Let me ungroup these to start with, and I'll repeat that again. So I've got 3 objects there. Draw a lasso around them to select them all. Right click, click group, and they then become one background object. And you can resize, you can move, you can layer that as a single object there. And to ungroup, you right click on, select that whole group, go to the context menu and ungroup them to divide them up. You also see them listed in the index, in the map index under elements. It will list group objects separately. And the last one in this little look at background objects is locking them. Now, these objects aren't locked at the moment, so I can accidentally click on something I didn't mean to. If I was editing and I wanted to put a floating topic over the top and I accidentally select one of them and resize it, then I've given myself a bit more work to fix that. So if I select all of these and right click and then do lock, locking a background object makes it unselectable again. I'm clicking on it now, so I could put a floating topic in, but I can't select those objects anymore. And this is really useful when you're working with tables or when you want to put floating topics over the top of background objects. You create your diagram first, then you lock it, and then you can edit the content that goes on the top without affecting the thing underneath. So again, there's some tips about locking and unlocking. This locking is a little bit more complex, because if you want to unlock a background object, you can't select it to do that. What you have to do is find it in the map index in the Elements tab. You can see the things that are locked have got locked after them in the bracket, and you can right click on one of them and unlock it again to get back control. Or you can right click in the background of the map, and in the background menu there's an option for unlocking all the background objects again. So if you lock yourself out completely, you can unlock everything again and get back to an editing status again. So that was quite a quick look at all the different options for editing background objects. Just one thing to mention, you can't disable the spell check in the text box shapes. So if you're using this for presentation and you don't want the red underline under technology words or buzzwords, add them to your dictionary, because you can't turn off the spell check in a text box shape at the moment. We mentioned smart shapes a bit earlier on. You would normally use smart shapes as a mix of background objects like a table or a grid, which are designed to hold other content. You put floating topics over the top of them, and they create a structure for your floating topics. So our little Razzie grid that we saw earlier on was an example of that. Background objects and the smart objects in particular work with smart rules, and we did a webinar a few months ago looking at this, the different drawing types, and you can not only draw a table and put topics in it, but you can get MindManager to process that for you. You can create some smart rules that say if a topic is in a particular cell within a smart shape, then do something with it. So this is an example from the webinar we did before. This grid here is a background object. It's a table smart shape. It's being locked so it won't move around. It's got some text just to mark the columns and the rows. They're locked as well. So what we can now do is drag a topic into this smart shape. Oh no. Oh, there we go. That one works. Doesn't look like anything happens in that cell. If I drag a topic into a cell, then MindManager's smart rules work out it's in column 1, row 1, or column 1, row 2, or whatever it is, and we've written some rules that say if it's in a particular place, then we do something to it, like add icons to it or add task information to it. So you can make your tables and funnels and swim lanes dynamic, so the MindManager will dynamically do things to topics, and that comes under smart rule settings. We're not going to go into smart rules today, but that's where smart shapes can be used to help process the information that's in your diagrams. Now, one of the challenges with using complicated tables, which we'll mention here, is that I mentioned earlier that the positioning of all your background objects is up to you to define that. What that means is that if you create a big table and you fill it full of floating topics, and you want to change the size of that table, or put another row in, or put a column in, or take a column out, you can end up having to do a lot of moving of floating topics to realign your table and get it back to meaningful condition. What we provide for you in this webinar is in the map downloads is a little tool called Smart Shape Editor. So people who are interested in using tables like this and and being able to manipulate them quite quickly, you get a copy of this map, which has got a macro embedded in it, and there's instructions on how to install it and how to get it to work, which just takes a minute to do that. But what you can then do is edit these smart shapes. So here we've got a little grid, 3x3, a table using a smart shape, and we've got floating topics in here. So if I were to resize or move this smart shape around, then the floating topics will stay where they are. But with the smart shape editor installed, if I go to smart shape editor, yes, okay, thank you. I can do things like insert a row. And if I insert a row into the smart shape now, it'll move all the contents of the rows further down, so the floating topics stay in the same cell that they were in before, and you've now got a new empty row in your smart shape. And now this is it's an experimental piece of software. We're very glad to get your feedback and suggestions for what kind of features you think are useful for that. But this is just I won't say it's an unofficial extension, but because it's coming through a MindJet webinar, but this isn't an extension that's going to be automatically updated and become necessarily part of the product. It's but we're working with ideas for how to do more stuff with smart shapes, and we'd welcome feedback from people who want to experiment with this kind of thing. So that's a smart shape editor, and if you're interested in using that feature, then make sure you get a copy of the map after the webinar, because it's embedded in that with instructions on how to use that. So that makes it easier to do things like deleting rows and columns in tables without having to rearrange all the data that you had. So that was quite a quick run through what background objects are, how to edit and create them, and a little bit on how to use them. Now they're not the answer to everything. So places where you might want to avoid using background objects are don't try and put them behind a tree of topics, because trees will move around as you add and remove branches, as you expand and collapse. The trees will change position, but the background objects won't. So it's unlikely that you'll be able to develop anything that's really meaningful using a combination of background objects and trees. They're really designed to sit behind floating topics. And if the data points in your diagram need more information, then don't use a background object for that, because that's what the floating topics are designed for. So if you need extra notes or hyperlinks or markers, then floating topics they're the right kind of thing to use to capture detailed information. There are limits on how much you can use background objects as the elements in a block diagram or a flowchart. And really the reason is that you've only got one arrow shape. If you want to rearrange your flowchart or block diagram, you'll spend a lot of time adjusting things by hand, because there's no inbuilt mechanism for connecting things as like there is in PowerPoint. You can't draw a line between two handles on the edges of two objects, not today anyway. So use floating topics and relationships to draw the kinds of diagram that might need to expand or move around very much. And remember that background objects won't export to a linear format. They're really an image. So any export that uses an image of what's in your map will work great. But if you export a background object with lots of floating topics to something else like Excel or to Word, what you might get out of that won't necessarily reflect the meaning that is in your background object in your table there. So use things like the map publishing feature. So when and how and where would you use these? Smart shapes are a really good use. So tables, flowcharts, funnels for dashboards, all that kind of thing. The visual representation, it can be really helpful for giving a big picture. And what we've done in quite a lot of the webinars here is use background object diagrams as a way to aid navigation of the map. So you'll have noticed in all the webinars I've done, from MindManager 18 onwards, the general pattern has been to have a picture on the left and a tree on the right, and they're related to each other. The detail, the breakdown is on the right hand side. The big picture overview is often on the left. So an example of that from a webinar we did a little while ago, diagram types in MindManager. And maybe some of you even attended this webinar. What we did here on the left hand side is draw a block diagram showing some relationships between big areas, the big picture, and we've also put in some subtopics under here with links. So I can click on a link that drills right down into a particular place in the tree. And this is a really great way to use a combination of a tree and a diagram, where you have your detail that might be 5 levels deep in a tree, and it's in the context of its parents and what it belongs to and everything else, and a cross-reference to the same thing, but in a higher level picture, in a higher level diagram. So from the tree, I can click on. Sorry, go back to where I was with that. From the tree, I can also make a link back into the diagram, or from the diagram, I can make a link into the tree. So you can jump either way. And a diagram is often a much better way to navigate into what might be a very complicated and very deep tree with hundreds of topics in it. You could navigate through the headings, or now what you can do is create a diagram that lets people jump straight to the part the detail that they need. And we've got the best of both worlds. We've got a high level diagram and infinite detail that can be broken down and expanded and collapsed in a tree as well. So that's another way to use background objects. So let's wrap this up and see how we're doing for questions. Going back to the beginning of the webinar, we talked about different types of diagram, and the summary here is just take a moment to choose the type of diagram you're going to draw, because diagrams take a lot longer to draw than trees. MindManager's USP, its key benefit is it can move at the speed of thought. So you can create trees really fast, and you can reorganize them really fast. By comparison, drawing two-dimensional diagrams with shapes takes a lot more time, and you're forever adjusting, or at least I am. I can't draw something and leave it alone. I have to keep on tweaking it. So have a think about what maintainability is going to be like, but really stay focused on what the purpose of your map is and what it was you want to communicate, and think about choosing a diagram type that helps you to explore patterns, principles, gaps, where things belong, where they don't belong. The diagram that helps you to do that and helps to communicate that, and then you'll really get value from doing that. Where you can prefer floating topics over text boxes, because a floating topic can carry a lot more information, including links to other parts of the map and other data. And use the grouping and the locking, which we saw earlier on. Grouping and locking will help you a lot when you start to edit these diagrams, because you could spend half an hour getting something just right. Then with just one move of the mouse, you could upset that and find yourself undoing things. So once you've got your background diagram pretty much right, then give it some protection by locking it, and then you can continue to edit the content over the top of that without destroying that. Thank you to everybody who's spent an hour with us this afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you at the next one.
Yeah, thanks a lot also from my side, actually, for everybody who attended, took their time. And I wish you a nice day, and hopefully we will see you again in one of our next public webinars. Bye-bye, everybody. Bye-bye, Nick.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Customer, you know it would be great. The quarter's coming to a close, so please don't hesitate.